how many propositions do you have in preaching Romans 1? Well, that question is answered by how many paragraphs are there? Because remember, a paragraph is a unit of thought. And that unit of thought, you're going to preach as one unit of thought. So that means you're only going to have as many propositional packages for Romans 1 as there are paragraphs. How many paragraphs are there? There are 5, verses 1 to 7, verses 8 to 15, verses 16 and 17, verses 18 to 23, and verses 24 to 32. We identified those in our earlier work. So I'm only going to have one proposition for verses 1 to 7, even if it takes me 8 messages to get through, which I think it might have, okay? I'm only going to have one proposition for verses 8 to 15, regardless of how many sermons it takes me to get through that paragraph, because there's only one central idea in that paragraph that I can reduce to a timeless truth. Same thing with verses 16 and 17. One proposition with verses 18 to 23, because the writer is only making one primary point in that paragraph. So I'm only going to make one primary point in that paragraph. Now, he explains it in different ways. I'm going to do that in my sermons, but I'm always going to have the same proposition. That make sense? So as I'm preaching that passage, the first page or two of my notes in review, I'm going to read the passage, and I'm going to tell them, here's what Paul is saying, and it's going to be the same thing I told him the week before Paul was saying, because that's the proposition. That's the meaning of that paragraph. Okay? So let's walk through these. All right, look at verses 1 to 7. Now, I'm going to show you outlines of this in a little bit. I'll put it up on the screen. I'm not going to show you my propositions. I've got them all here. I'll read them. You look at the text and you'll get a feel for, and I'm going to read just a little more than the timeless truth just to give you context. Let's look at verses 1 to 7. Here's how I began once I got through my general introduction, which I did in one message. And then, I hate to admit to you, but yes, I did a message on Paul because it had been a long time. A lot of people had come to our church since I had dealt with, who is this guy? And, we're beginning his longest letter, and his background factors really importantly into Romans because he was a Pharisee who was living on works righteousness. And so I thought it was very important to take them, for example, to Philippians 3 and show them his spiritual autobiography, how he used to rely on his own efforts and works, and he came to understand justification by faith alone and to treasure it. And so I did a message on Paul. When I began Romans, I did a message, first of all, a general introduction message, much of what I shared with you a couple days ago, where I walked them through the amazing importance of this book, how it compares to Paul's other letters, who wrote it, where he wrote it, when he wrote it, and why he wrote it. And I walked them through an outline of the book, took them through the whole book. Here's an overview of the book. Second thing I did, that was one message. Second message I preached was on Paul. But now let's come to the paragraph itself. Here's how I sort of brought them into my propositional package for that first paragraph. Paul's letters follow the basic form of the letters of the first century. Okay, I'd already made that point, kind of explained that. But he does more than follow the typical epistolary genre. He uses the opening of his letters as a means to communicate Christian truth. Neither Paul nor the Holy Spirit wastes words. Again, I'm giving you a little more than just the timeless truth. I'm leading there. I just want you to get the context. Instead, these opening verses are absolutely crucial and foundational for understanding this letter. And then I made like an applicational point, even in my introduction. I said, let me encourage you in your own reading and in your own study, or in our study together, don't be in a hurry to get past all of this preliminary stuff so we can get to the good part, down to verses 16 and 17. In reality, I said, and here's where I get to my timeless truth and my transition. In reality, in verses 1 to 7, we learn why this book is important. There's the timeless truth. That's why this mattered to the readers. I got to give you a little background because it'd be hard for you to track with me if I don't do this. First century letter, different than ours. We get a letter, you got who it's to at the top, you get the letter, you open it, you look to page 3 to see who it's from. First century letters, as you know, were not that way. You unrolled the scroll, the first thing you saw was who it's from, and then there was a greeting, and then it was who it was to. So it was all right there at the beginning of the scroll. It makes perfect sense logistically. How frustrating if it was at the end of the scroll. Okay, so this just makes sense. I'm having to ask myself, what does this opening, these first 7 verses, what do they contribute to what Paul's trying to do in Romans? Well, clearly, in his case, and in the first opening verses of Romans, these verses help the Romans know why this letter is important, right? I mean, they open it, what's the first word they see? Paul. Wow, we got a letter from Paul. And then he gives them a brief introduction to what he wants to talk about, the gospel, and then he addresses them. And so this is why I condensed these first 7 verses to this timeless truth. Verses 1 to 7 explain why this book matters. It explains why Romans is important. There's the timeless truth that I pulled from those first 7 verses. In this initial greeting, Paul gives us 3 reasons why Romans matters and why it should matter to us. Why it mattered to the first century readers and why it should matter to us. In this case, I left a past tense in because I wanted them to understand that I'm tying the two together. This opening is what made this letter really important to the Roman church. I can promise you when one of those churches in Rome, when the pastor of one of those churches in Rome opened this letter, Phoebe delivered it, and he opened it and saw it was from Paul. And he saw, wow, look at this opening about the gospel. And it's to us. That made the rest of what was in this letter matter, right? So you see where I'm coming from, where I came up with that as my timeless truth, that these verses underscore why Romans matters. And what was my plural noun? You remember? 3 reasons. So there are, and I'll show you the outline later as to what those 3 reasons were, but that was my propositional package for every message I did in the first 7 verses. Paul is explaining why Romans matters, why it's important. Okay? Let me go to the next one. Let's see here. Romans 8 to 15. All right. Find it here, all these pages. There we go. All right. Again, let me give you a little context. We're looking now at the propositional package for verses 8 to 15. Today we begin the second section in the opening of this letter, Paul's thanksgiving and prayer for the Romans. You see, I'm sort of acclimating them. I'm kind of telling them this is where we're going to be. And then I read those verses. And then out of reading the verses, I said, this paragraph describes the historical circumstances that were behind the writing of this letter. It records the personal interaction between the Apostle Paul and the churches in Rome. We could keep our discussion of the text at that level. In other words, we could make it historical. We could make it about the past. But I think we would miss so much richness because this paragraph has so much more to teach us than merely the historical circumstances surrounding the writing of this letter. So as we study this passage, we will learn the first century circumstances that prompted Paul to write to the Romans. But we will also learn how Paul thought and how we should think about the fellowship of believers in the church. Okay? So I'm now telling them this paragraph isn't just about Paul saying, you know, I really thank God for you guys. And, you know, I thought about coming and I wasn't able to come, and you need to know that I wanted to come for this reason. I I could preach all of that as part of the past, but that's not helpful. All of Scripture is given for our instruction. It's given for our help. What better place to go to understand how to think about our Christian relationships than Paul's heart for these people? And so I go on to say this. So there was my timeless truth. We learn how we should think about the fellowship of believers in the church. Actually, it was larger than that. I said, we will learn how Paul thought, because it's so historical, I needed to leave it sort of in the past tense, and how we should think. Now you see I've made the bridge about the fellowship of believers in the church. By his example, Paul shows us how to interact with those around us in the church who have believed the gospel he preached. Paul understood the Christian life was never meant to be solely about our private relationship with God. It was meant to be a shared life with other Christians. He understood the priority of Christian relationships. He delighted in those relationships. He loved his brothers and sisters and committed his life to them. In Romans 1:8-15, we see Paul's mindset toward his fellow Christians. And here it is. And in this passage, Paul teaches us by example the commitments we must make to all of our Christian relationships as well. What's my plural noun? Commitments. The commitments that we must make to our Christian relationships. And then I said, let me give you all of the commitments Paul made to his fellow Christians, and then we'll begin to examine each of them carefully. And then I actually, in this case, I went through them first. I gave them, I don't always do that. In fact, I rarely do that, but I gave them my outline first because there are enough of them that I wanted them to be able to track with me. And then I came back and developed each one of them. Now, I'll show you that in a few minutes with the outline. Okay, let me go to verses 16 and 17. All right, now we're at the propositional package for verses 16 and 17. Because of Paul's message, and again, I'm giving you more context. Because of Paul's message, the outside world, both the Jews and the Greeks, had labeled him as a fool and a shameful man. That comes out of my exegesis. The word ashamed doesn't just mean something subjective. In the first century world, it was a world of shame and honor. It was driven by shame and honor. And there was an objective shame. A person was shamed because of certain things. And the cross, in the Roman world, even though they crucified more people than almost than any other empire that ever existed, they didn't talk about it. Cicero said, it is shameful to discuss, and he didn't even use the word cross. And so it was truly a shameful thing to even discuss in public. And Paul says, we worship a man who was crucified, and he's God. That brought objective shame on him. And Paul says in response to that, I am not ashamed. So, he says, let me go back here. They had labeled him as a fool and a shameful man. He was without a sense of honor and thus deserving of ill respect and bad treatment. But in spite of all that, Paul says he is unashamed. Here it is. How could Paul ignore the public shame that came with his message? In Romans 1:16 and 17, as he lays out the thesis of his book, he explains why he felt no shame. And as he explains his own lack of shame, he provides us with the reasons that as Christians, we should never be ashamed of the gospel. Okay? What's my plural noun? Reasons. And that's what he does. Notice, look at verses 16 and 17. I am not ashamed of the gospel. What? For. Because. Here's why. He's giving us reasons. So you see, I'm tying my plural noun to what he's doing here. I'm not making that up. That flows out of what he's saying. And so then my message, and I'll show you the outline again in a little bit, my outline points were reasons that we should not be, that Paul wasn't ashamed of the gospel and that we should not be ashamed of the gospel. even in a culture like his, where it brought objective shame, where you were marginalized because polite people shouldn't talk about the cross. That's why to the Greeks it was foolishness, and certainly to the Romans it was also considered anathema. You did it, it happened, but people who were somebody didn't talk about it. Okay? Let's move on to the next paragraph, verses 18 to 23. In this case, and we'll talk about introductions, but in some cases I have an introduction and lead into the passage. Other times, just for variety, I start by reading the passage. Variety is a good thing, and so this time I just started by reading the passage. And then here's what I said after reading the passage. We desperately need the gospel because there is such a thing as the wrath of God against human sin. There's my timeless truth. That's what this paragraph is saying. And then here it is more specifically. God's wrath is being revealed against every immoral pagan. That is what that paragraph is saying. God's wrath is being revealed against every pagan. Now, how do I develop that? I said, as we walk through this text, it naturally falls into two parts. In this case, I'm opting for a little different direction because it's going to answer two different questions. So it's not like there's an easy word that's going to describe both of those questions. So in this case, I said two parts, or I could say two questions. There are different ways different plural nouns I could have used. But then I'm looking at both of these passages together. And I said, in verses 18 to 23, why is God's wrath revealed? And in verses 24 to 32, how is God's wrath revealed? First of all, in verses 18 to 23, why is God's wrath revealed? And I said, in verses 18 to 23, Paul identifies two reasons God is angry with every pagan. Two reasons. And that's, again, I'm using the word reason again because I think that is exactly what he's doing. I'm not wimping out. I worked hard to come up with the right word to try to discern what Paul was doing in that paragraph. And there are two reasons that he's angry with every pagan. And again, I'll show you that outline in a few minutes. But that's the propositional package. So let's go to the final one, 24 to 32. This section, again, I'm going to give you more context. This section indicts all who have rejected the true God of the Bible and refused to worship him. Paul says that when it comes to all unbelieving pagans, verse 18, the wrath of God is being revealed right now. In this paragraph, verses 24 to 32, Paul's structure is easy to follow. And then I take them to the passage. I want them to see Paul's structure. Verse 24, God gave them over. Verse 26, God gave them over. Verse 28, God gave them over. 3 times, Paul says, God gave them over. In other words, there are 3 specific ways God's wrath of abandonment is being revealed against unbelieving pagans. What's my plural noun? Ways. 3 ways. As verses 24 to 32 unfold, there are 3 ways. What are those 3 ways? Those kind of jump out at you. He abandons to sexual sin, he abandons to homosexuality, and he abandons to a depraved mind. 3 ways. Again, that's simply following the flow of Paul's thought. Questions about the propositional packages here in Romans, or just generally the whole concept?
I noticed that in some of them you include a verbal idea, but not in all of them. There are guys who make a big deal that every main point of your sermon should include a call to action.
Yeah, we're going to get there. I don't believe that's true, because I don't think you ought to create what isn't there. Let's say you're preaching through a narrative, and the first part of that narrative is merely setting up the story. How do you, sometimes you do believe as you work through that text that there is a sort of implied command there. Okay, then capture that. But not always. Sometimes it's just the setup of the story. And it's really not, you're fabricating something. Again, you want to capture the author's intent as much as possible. And so I do use, somebody asked me about that. These couple of examples I threw up here, the outline points tend to be that imperative, accept responsibility, etc. I don't always do that. We're going to talk about the different outlines. In fact, I intentionally vary my outlines for two reasons. One, I want to follow the flow of the passage where it takes me. And two, even if the flow of the passage is such that week after week, it's always the same, I may want to vary it just for variety because there are different ways to capture the point of that section of the paragraph. We'll talk about outlining in just a minute, okay? All right. Any other questions about, yeah?
So when you do that first part, that first message from Romans 1:24 following on sexual sin, do you have like a separate sub-proposition for that message, or how are you you're spending a whole sermon on just one point under your proposition?
Yeah. Stick with me. I think when I get to outlines, and I'm gonna show you, I'm gonna give you my detailed homiletic outline for the entire chapter. And I think that will become a little clearer when we look through that. So if I don't answer that question when we get there, let me know, okay? Okay, so let's talk about then the delivery. Now we've done that, okay. The delivery of the proposition and the transitional sentence. When do you actually provide it in your sermon? Well, generally, and that's the key word, generally near the end of the introduction, just before the first main division. Why would that be important? Because it's easy for people to track with you. You've just told them, I'm going to give you principles, and then you say, here's principle number 1. Whereas if it's early, you say, I'm going to give you principles, and then, 5-10 minutes later, you say, here's principle number 1. It's kind of hard for them to still know where you're going. So it just makes sense, usually, to have that propositional package near the end of the introduction, just before the first main division. It can be usually, not always, but most of the time, it'll be after you've read the text. Okay? There are 2 reasons, however, that I said generally, that's the norm. There are 2 viable reasons for presenting your case first, your evidence first, and then bringing your proposition as your conclusion. There are 2 viable reasons for doing that. Number 1, if you have a hostile audience who's not going to listen to you once you present the proposition. I'll give you a great biblical example of that. Peter's sermon on the day of Pentecost. He brings all his evidence to bear, and then he gives his proposition. Verse 36 of Acts 2, therefore, let all the house of Israel know for certain that God has made him both Lord and Christ, this Jesus whom you crucified. Because he knew a riot was likely to erupt, when he got to the proposition. He could have given that first. That is his sermon's proposition. But the chances are they would not have been as likely to have listened to the evidence he presented. So he presents his evidence first, and then he concludes with his proposition. So if you're preaching to a hostile audience, let's say you're asked to speak in the local school. It happens. And you're talking to a bunch of pagan kids who, then maybe what you need to do as you're teaching through or preaching through a passage is you need to explain and bring them along with you, and then you dump the proposition on them at the end, where you sort of bring it all together and you bring it to bear like he did here. Another viable reason to put the proposition at the end is a narrative passage that builds to the main point. You don't want to give away your proposition at the beginning if the point of the story is leading to that. You want to be a good storyteller, like the writers of Scripture are a good storyteller. I'm thinking of one passage that jumps into my mind is 1 Samuel 17. We talked about this the other day with David and Goliath. When I preached that sermon, I built to the proposition at the at the end of the sermon. I want to hit them at the end, that what distinguishes a man after God's own heart is that he has a passion for the glory of God. That's what drives him. And that comes in that speech David makes to Goliath at the end. It's hinted at throughout, but boy, it comes to a head in that final speech he makes when he says, "How dare you?" Okay? So there's another reason, if you're preaching through a narrative section and you want to wait to give them the main point of this passage after you've walked through the details of the narrative and you've sort of built to it. Okay? If you're tempted to skip the proposition, I want you to listen to J.H. Jowett. I love this. He says, "No sermon is ready for preaching, not ready for writing out, until we can express its theme in a short, pregnant sentence as clear as crystal. I find the getting of that sentence is the hardest, the most exacting, and the most fruitful labor in my study. I do not think any sermon ought to be preached or even written until that sentence has emerged clear and lucid as a cloudless moon." It's a great quote, and he's absolutely right. So, a proposition. That's where you begin writing a sermon, is you take the theme of the passage, you make it timeless, and then you build to show them how that's developed in that passage. All right, let's move on. Structuring the lesson is the second step in writing a sermon. Structure the lesson. By this, I'm really dealing with the main divisions, the main sections of an organized sermon. The benefits are obvious. It makes the main points of the sermon clear. It assists the congregation in two things. It assists them in remembering the flow of the sermon, but more importantly, if you do it the way I'm encouraging you to here, it helps them remember the flow of the passage. All right? So, what are the principles then for creating structural outlines? Number one, this is primary. It should follow and reflect your syntactical analysis. It should reflect what you did in your block diagram. Now, let me just say this. I was commenting in the break to someone. You don't necessarily, when you look at your block diagram, most of the time you will follow its flow, its order, and most of the time you will reflect what it emphasizes in your outline as well. But just like in all writing, sometimes writers, in just the structure of the flow of their thought, they elevate something that's not as important to a level of importance in the structure, the syntactical structure. And sometimes something that is important is relegated syntactically to a little bit lower level. Those are exegetical calls you have to make as you're working through. You're always asking yourself, what is he really stressing here? That's the key. So even if your syntactical analysis doesn't automatically lead you there, which usually it will, you're always asking yourself, what is he emphasizing? And that's what I want to emphasize as well. All right? The bottom line, don't force an outline on a text, but allow the text to inform your outline. Outlining starts with understanding the natural and grammatical divisions of the text. And then the sermon structure is dependent on, or at least heavily influenced by, the structure of the text. We understand how the author put the biblical text together. In this way, we not only, I love this, not only do we preach what the author says, but we even emphasize it the way he emphasizes it. Say, how many major points should I have? What's the answer to that question? As many as the text has. As many as your syntactical analysis shows. Okay? So, you let the text drive the number of outline points. Number two, it should grow out of the proposition. This is just a sort of backward way of looking at it. Your outline points should tie back to the timeless truth of the passage. Why? Because the paragraph is about that point. It's about the point the author's making. And so the points you're making in your outline points should tie to that main point. So it should grow out of the proposition. Each main point should serve a specific purpose to develop the proposition. The outline should have a strong, clear relationship to the theme of the passage. And each point should express only one aspect of that theme. Thirdly, and again, these are in some ways just different ways of saying the same thing. Each main point should define the key word in the transition sentence. Principles. Is this outline point a principle? Okay. Reasons. Is this outline point a reason? They should not overlap. They should be clear and distinct points. And this is basic. You understand this, but I mentioned it. Each should contain a single idea. Number 5, ordinarily, they should show progression through the passage. Again, most of the time, 98% of the time, you want to follow the flow of the passage. There are a couple of reasons you may not follow the flow of the passage. Let's say, for example, that you want to really hit them at the end with the main point, and the main point comes toward the beginning. Maybe you save that and go back, and you might say, you'll notice I skipped something here. Well, here's really the key to this passage, and boom, you go back and you address it. But most of the time, you're going to follow the flow of the passage in your outline points through the author's flow. They should be limited in number. This appears to contradict what I said earlier, that the text itself determines how many outline points. But why would I say this? Why should they be limited in number? You're going to lose people, but there's even a bigger issue. A paragraph is only going to have a finite number of points that it's making about that theme. And so, it shouldn't be 25, or it's probably not a paragraph. You're probably dealing with a huge section instead of a paragraph. They should be parallel. Parallel in what way? What do I mean by parallel? Each outline point should be structured in the same way. Same parts of speech. Let's say you have definite article, adjective, noun as your first outline point. Then your other outline points should, for the most part, as much as lies within you, should have article, adjective, noun. Why is that? What would be the reason for that? All the texts teach that, but why? Everything you're doing here is not only to lead them through the passage, but it's to make it clear. If your outline points are structured differently, the guy sitting out there taking notes is going, I wonder is that a main point or is that you don't want that. You want him to be able to track with you easily. And so by structuring them similarly, parallel, they can follow. If you're going to use alliteration, okay, make them all alliterated. But I would encourage you, don't overdo alliteration, all right? That gets old. Think of yourself for a moment. It's better if your outline is like your skeleton. I'm glad you all have skeletons, but I don't really want to see them like up close and personal. So the outline really becomes the bones on which the meat is placed. So they're there, they hold the structure together, they help the person see you're flowing through the text, but don't like cut your arm and show me your bone. I don't really want to see that. So don't stress them so much by always alliterating them, for example, that people lose the meaning of the text for your cute alliteration. There's some really humorous examples. We're all tempted to do this. Even the greatest preachers are tempted to do this. When I was at Grace to You, we had to deal with a couple of ones that John had done through the years that were really quite hilarious. Because what happens if you alliterate is always, this, you try to alliterate and like 4 of your 5 points work beautifully. And then there's that 5th point. It's like, oh boy, is there a, it reminds me of the Herman cartoon where the guy is, he's this monk. He's obviously in the monastery making a copy of the scripture. And at the top of the page that he's just begun of the scripture, there's this really elaborate bee. It's obviously taking him like a week to draw this bee with a box around it and all the squirrels and swirlies, like the illuminated manuscripts used to be. And the caption says, does anyone know another word for verily that starts with a B? It's like, you don't want to do that. So, but you're sitting there thinking, okay, here's this fifth point. I don't have something. Break out the thesaurus. All right, what's another word? Well, John did that a couple of times, and he was preaching through the crucifixion, the miracles. That's what it was. The miracles in Matthew after in conjunction with the death of Christ, with the resurrection. No, I'm trying to remember. No, it was the crucifixion. It's crucifixion. And one of his alliterated points for the earthquake was soil disturbance. Yes, sirree. That doesn't work, guys. That gets in the way. So we're all tempted to do it, even great preachers like John, but don't do it. Far better not to have an alliterated outline than for people to do what you're doing right now, which is, oh, that's hilarious. They're nudging each other, and, he had to work hard for that. You've lost them. You've lost the truth for your sort of cuteness. So don't do that. Just if some form of alliteration works and it really falls into place, and you can use words that express the meaning, that don't sort of clutter, people aren't laughing, then fine. But don't get carried away with it. Okay. Also, in terms of parallel parts of speech, alliteration, you can also use word endings. Sometimes ing ending the first word of each outline point. There are different ways you can get there. Similar sound. You'll notice one of the ones I had P's, that P sound, but not with P's. So, there are different ways to sort of try to capture people's minds, but don't get so cute that in the middle of it they're tracking with your outline and not with the truth. Should be timeless principle form. In other words, in your main outline points, for the most part, I'm not saying there would never be an exception to this. There might be. I'm just saying generally, you don't want to have proper names, places, incidents from the past. You want them to be timeless. All right? There may be places in narrative, particularly in the Gospels, where that's not true. It just makes sense for you to say, Jesus did this and then Jesus did that. That may make sense. So I'm not saying never. I'm just saying generally, particularly when you come to the teaching sections of the New Testament, the epistles, that would be true. All right. The types of outlines. There is more than one possible homiletical outline. Even if you have the same syntactical analysis, you can create different outlines because there are three primary types of major points. There are directives, that is an imperative. There are statements or questions, that is indicative. And there are markers of the text, that is, they just sort of show the flow of the text through the passage. Let me give you examples of each of these. First of all, in terms of directives, or the imperative mood. I showed you 1 Corinthians 3, 9-17. Build on the right foundation. Use the right materials. Remember the rightful owner. Those are imperatives. Why did I choose imperatives for that section? Because that's really the force of what Paul's doing there. He's saying, I want you to build like this. And so therefore, I captured the flow of the passage in imperatives. Don't force this approach on the text. Use variety, and don't do it this way every time. The second approach is the indicative mood, where you either use questions or statements. Let me give you a couple of examples from my own preaching through Ephesians. Ephesians 4, verses 2 through 16, that whole section is about preserving the unity of the church. I say section because there are paragraphs within this section, but this is the larger section. So here's how I saw it in paragraphs. In verses 4 to 6, you have that list of we share these things in common. And so here's how I structured my outline. We share a common life. We share a common origin, one Spirit. We share a common future, one hope. We share a common master, one Lord. We share a common belief, one faith. We share a common confession, Jesus is Lord, one baptism. That's what happened at baptism. We share a common God and Father, one God and Father of all, who is over all and through all and in all. So that is an indicative outline. It's a statement outline. But why did I choose that form of outline there? Because that's what Paul is doing. He's saying, if you look at Ephesians 4, he's saying we need to be united because after all, we share these things in common. All right? Let me give you another example of the indicative mood. Later in that same chapter, as he's telling us how to keep this unity, he's saying you need to follow the plan that Christ has put in place for the church to function together as a unity. And so I looked at the components of Christ's plan there. In verses 7 to 10, Christ distributes spiritual gifts to the church. Secondly, Christ appoints the leaders of the church. Verse 11, gifted men he's given to the church. Thirdly, the leaders equip the members of the church. And then the members accomplish the ministry of the church as they fulfill the work of service. Okay? And then the end of verse 12, the plan results in the growth of the church. So you see how those are just statements tracking through the plan, Christ's plan for the church. Here's how it works. When I preached verse 13 of that same text, it's the goal of Christ's plan. The plan is, we just went through the components of the plan. Here's the goal of the plan, verse 13 of Ephesians 4. In fact, look at that, just so you kind of see it. Ephesians 4, verse 13. Keep doing this, he says, follow the plan I just gave you in verses 7 through 10, until we all attain to the unity of the faith and of the knowledge of the Son of God, to a mature man, to the measure of the stature which belongs to the fullness of Christ. Now, when I initially preached this, not at Shepherd's Conference, which I did a few years ago, but in my own church, it's like a series of questions, still indicatives. When will reach the goal? Who will reach the goal? How do we reach the goal? What is the goal? So that was the outline. Those are questions. That's in the indicative mood. So a different form of outline. The third kind of outline is markers of the text. Here's an example, just to give you, where you're just marking the flow of the text. So you have the command, the method, the results. You're just sort of tracking through the passage in that way, and you're identifying the flow of thought in the passage. Here's an example from my own preaching in Mark 2, verses 18 to 22. This is markers of the text. A specific question about fasting, verse 18, a specific answer about fasting, verses 19 and 20, a general principle about Jesus' kingdom, verses 21 to 22. Okay, so the question starts about fasting, but then Jesus uses it as an opportunity to make a more general point about his kingdom. Another example of the markers of the text from preaching through Matthew 18, that parable you remember of the unforgiving slave, a picture of God's forgiveness of us, that's the first half of that parable. A picture of our unwillingness to forgive others, the second half of that parable. That's markers of the text. I'm just helping people see how the story tracks in the text. Another example would be the parable of the soils. And I preached through the parable of the soils. Markers of the text would be the unreceptive heart, the superficial heart, the preoccupied heart, and the prepared heart. Yeah.
Do you know what were your propositions that went with those? Because, like, what's the plural noun that would you?
Yeah, I don't remember. I'm sorry, I didn't capture that here. I have to look back at the message itself. If you want, maybe at the break, I can look, but I don't remember offhand. But just putting it together, maybe in Matthew 18, the story of the unforgiving slave, it probably was something like God demands that we express to others the forgiveness we enjoy. Okay, that might be the timeless truth. And then the transitional statement might be he presents this truth in two pictures. Okay, playing off the word picture. Two pictures. First, a picture of God's forgiveness of us. Second picture, a picture of our unwillingness to forgive others. So that probably is close enough. That gives you the idea.